The spring of 2009 came in sideways across Harlan County. The old-timers could feel it, that particular heaviness in the air that meant the rain wasn't just coming, it was staying. Every farmer in the valley was preparing. Gravel, drainage trenches, retaining walls built from fieldstone piled 3 courses high. Sump pumps humming in basements, culverts cleared of winter debris. Men who had farmed this land for 40 years were moving like something serious was on its way. And then, up on the ridge, there was Delphine Calloway. She wasn't hauling gravel. She wasn't building walls. She was planting kudzu, a beat of silence. Then, from below, laughter. "Lord have mercy," a man called out from the fence line. "That woman has finally lost it." Nobody asked what she was doing. Nobody needed to, they thought. But nobody, not one of them, thought to ask what she knew. If you've ever watched someone do something unconventional and felt the quiet suspicion that they might actually be right, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay with us. Stories like this one are why we're here. And tell us where you're watching from. This story has traveled further than Delphine ever expected. Yours might too. Delphine Calloway had lived on the ridge above Caney Fork Creek for 22 years. She hadn't inherited the land. She'd bought it, 38 acres of it, at an estate auction in 1987 for a price that made everyone around her assume she'd made a terrible mistake. They weren't wrong about the land, they were wrong about her. She rose before sunlight every morning. She kept a battered field journal, green cover, wire-bound, that she'd been filling since the late 1980s. Rainfall dates, soil temperatures, what planted, what held, what washed. She wasn't a scientist. She hadn't finished college, but she paid attention the way some people pay rent, because not doing it cost more. Her nearest neighbor, Harlan Pruitt, a third-generation cattle rancher whose family had worked this valley since before the TVA dammed the creek, remembered the first time he really noticed her. She'd walk her fence line after every rain, every single time. Most folks just check for breaks. She was looking at where the water went, didn't think much of it then. She asked questions nobody else thought to ask. Why did the eastern pasture stay green a week longer than the western one? Why did one gully grow, while another, just 50 yards away, slowly filled itself in? She wrote everything down, and she never explained herself, unless someone asked. Nobody usually did. The hillside above her barn was, by any honest assessment, a slow emergency. It had been logged twice, once in the 1940s, once in the 1970s. The second time had been careless, slash left on steep ground, no replanting plan, just a check written and a hillside abandoned to whatever came next. What came next was rain. Without root networks to slow it, every storm became an extraction. The topsoil, that dark, living layer built over centuries, went first. Then the subsoil. What remained was pale clay and fractured rock, slick as tile when wet, cracked like a kiln when dry. Gullies had opened up 8, 10, 12 inches deep. In places, the exposed roots of old oaks reached out into open air, like the fingers of something drowning. One bad storm, Delphine knew, and part of that hillside could simply give way. Grass refused to hold, seed washed before it rooted. She had tried broadcast seeding twice. Both times, the first real rain took most of it. The soil wasn't just damaged, it had lost the ability to heal itself. And still, she wasn't done with it. Word got around fast in Harlan County. Delphine Calloway was putting kudzu on the ridge, intentionally. Rufus Blankenship, the county extension advisor, a man who had given the same kudzu removal talk at every Farm Bureau meeting since 1994, heard it and nearly spilled his coffee. Kudzu is a federal noxious weed. It'll climb everything you own, your fence posts, your barn, your tractor if you leave it sitting. I've seen it take a tree line in 3 seasons. Once it's in, it's in. I went up there and I told her. I said, "Delphine, I understand you're trying, but this is a mistake you will not recover from." Calvin Trest, a retired tobacco farmer who had watched 4 neighboring hillsides wash out over 40 years, walked the fence line with her and pointed at the slope. I told her, "That vine doesn't know when to quit." She just looked at me and said, "Neither do I." It was the only thing she said in her own defense, and she never repeated it. The logic of the critics was not unreasonable. Kudzu, Pueraria, Montana, had been introduced to the American South as a conservation plant in the 1930s, endorsed by the very USDA that later declared it invasive. Its spread had consumed millions of acres. Its reputation was earned. But Delphine wasn't asking permission, and she wasn't done reading. She had found it almost by accident. 3 winters before the planting, she'd gone through a box of her late father's agricultural papers. He'd farmed in Virginia, been involved briefly with soil conservation work in the New Deal era. Among the old almanacs and planting calendars was a thin USDA bulletin, faded yellow at the edges, titled Emergency Erosion Control on Depleted Slopes, 1936 to 1943. It outlined a program, largely forgotten by then, that had used fast-establishing cover plants, including kudzu, to stabilize critically eroded slopes as a temporary measure while native vegetation was re-established beneath. The key word, underlined in her father's hand, was temporary. She found 2 more references in an agricultural library in Knoxville: a 1941 Appalachian Conservation Report, a chapter in a 1950s soil management textbook, the kind used in land-grant university extension programs and then quietly discontinued. The science was straightforward. A fast-growing vine with a root system that could reach 6 feet deep and spread laterally for yards in a single season would do what nothing else could do quickly enough: slow the water, hold the clay, buy the soil time to remember itself. If, and this was the part no one ever got to in the argument, if it was managed afterward. The first spring was not encouraging. A late freeze took nearly a third of what she'd planted. Another section failed to take in a patch of particularly compacted subsoil near the old skid road. Rufus Blankenship drove past twice, slowly. He didn't stop to say anything. He didn't need to. She could see his point being made from the road. Her daughter, Vanessa, called from Nashville and asked if she was reconsidering. "No," Delphine said. "Why not?" "Because the ones that survived look good." She replanted the dead sections with rooted cuttings. She rerouted a small drainage swale by hand, 3 days with a mattock, to redirect water around the most resistant patch. She worked alone most mornings before the day got warm. Nobody offered to help. She didn't ask. By midsummer of that first year, something was already changing on the ridge, not dramatically. Nothing you'd notice driving past, but if you walked it, if you knelt down and looked, the signs were there. Where the vines had established thickly, the ground beneath was damp hours after it should have dried. Rainwater that had previously sheeted off the slope in muddy sheets was slowing, spreading, soaking in. In one low section, Delphine found earthworms, the first she had seen in that soil in years. She didn't mention it to anyone. She wrote it in her journal and kept planting. A thin fuzz of grass, native fescue, from seed she'd broadcast under the vine canopy, appeared in a patch the size of a dining room table. The gully that had been carving itself deeper every spring for years did not open that summer. It didn't close either, but it didn't open. Harlan Pruitt noticed. I didn't say anything to her. Wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I noticed. By late September of 2009, the forecast from Knoxville had grown serious. A slow-moving low-pressure system was stalling over the Cumberland Plateau. The National Weather Service was using words like multi-day event and saturated soils and elevated flood risk. The creek gauges that usually floated around 4 feet were already reading 6. The old sign, "The swallows flew low and didn't stop." The cattle moved on their own to the upper pastures. The creek smelled different, the particular mineral smell of upstream disturbance. Calvin Trest moved his equipment to the barn on high ground and didn't go home that night. Delphine Calloway walked the hillside at dusk with a flashlight. She tested the soil with her hand. She came back inside and made coffee and waited. It rained for 4 days. 18 inches fell in Harlan County from Tuesday through Friday. The creek came up 11 feet and took out a wooden bridge that had stood since 1952. 3 hillsides on the east side of the valley lost their topsoil in visible sheets. One embankment behind a neighboring property collapsed overnight, taking a fence line and a stretch of road with it. The runoff from the slopes around Caney Fork Creek ran red-brown for 2 days. Billions of soil particles in suspension, the labor of centuries washing toward the Tennessee River. Her hillside was green. Not untouched, water had moved through it, pooled in places, scoured a small rut near the upper edge. But the dense vine canopy had broken the rainfall before it hit the soil, absorbing impact and slowing velocity. The deep root network, some individual roots now 5 and 6 feet into the clay, had anchored the slope. The gullies had not opened. The topsoil had not moved. The soil beneath the canopy was saturated but stable. Rufus Blankenship drove out that Saturday morning. He stood at the fence line for a long time. He didn't say anything when Delphine walked up beside him. Finally, "How far down do those roots go?" "Far enough," she said. Here is the part of the story most people don't know. Delphine had never planned to keep the kudzu. Starting in the spring of 2010, she began the second phase of what she had always understood to be a 2-part plan. She cut back the vines methodically, section by section, working from the bottom of the slope upward. Where the soil had stabilized, she replaced kudzu with native warm-season grasses, big bluestem, Indian grass, city oats grama. She planted deep-rooted shrubs along the old gully lines, buttonbush, native sumac, elderberry, whose root systems would take over where the kudzu left off. She treated it like surgery, careful, intentional, nothing removed until something permanent was in place to replace it. By 2012, the hillside held a patchwork of native cover, managed shrubs, and a few sections of residual vine, kept only where the soil still needed time. By 2014, the kudzu was largely gone. What remained was a stable hillside, productive, vegetated, biologically active, that had arrived at that state through one of the most misunderstood plants in American agriculture. I had to go back and read some old USDA material I hadn't looked at in 30 years. She was right about the original program. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd only ever seen kudzu as a problem to remove. She was using it as a tool, with an exit plan. He paused. That's the part I missed. Delphine Calloway still walks her fence line after every rain. She still keeps the Green Journal, though it's on its 4th volume now. She gives talks at the County Agricultural Extension Office twice a year, invited by Rufus Blankenship himself, who credits her with changing the way he thinks about emergency erosion management. Calvin Trest stopped by one afternoon in 2013, stood at the fence line, and looked at the hillside for a while. "You always knew it would hold?" he asked. "I knew it had a chance," she said. "That was enough." He nodded. He didn't say he was sorry for doubting her. He didn't need to. She didn't need to hear it. She already had what she wanted, 38 acres of land that could outlast her. The land rarely rewards those who fight it. More often, it rewards those who take the time, patient, humble, unglamorous time, to understand it. Delphine Calloway didn't beat the hillside. She listened to it. She read what others had learned and forgotten. She used a plant that everyone feared because she understood something most people had stopped asking: why it was planted in the first place. And when the heavy rains came, the kind of rains that don't ask permission, her hillside answered. As Wendell Berry wrote, "The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy responsibility. Before you go, we want to hear from you." Have you ever watched someone do something unconventional, something everyone around them dismissed, only to discover, later, that they were right all along? Leave your story in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. This is a big world, and stories like Delphine's remind us how much quiet wisdom still lives in it.